welcome everyone here and television audience as well to InfoHealth, a monthly program. So it's every Wednesday, no, first Wednesday of every month at 2 p.m., not 1 p.m. as some advertised in some of the papers. But anyway, it's now in its 14th year. It's really extraordinary. And for those watching on television, it's been a partnership of this library, the Niagara Lake Library, some physicians locally, and Kojiko, the television network, which amplifies the message considerably, and for which we're very, very grateful. But it's also the Michael DeGroat School of Medicine in Niagara, and we're very appreciative of their help to medical students and medical students aspirants, one of which we have with us today, and I'll introduce them in just a second. But anyway, just to acknowledge all of those sources, I think is very important. Debbie Krause does all of the work setting up here in the library. Now, the next, just so the audience realizes, the next InfoHealth session in December is on December the 11th, December the 11th. And so that's at 2 p.m. It's an important one because the research director for MAC in the Niagara Peninsula is going to be talking, and he's talking about people like me, meaning older people, and the healthcare system. And I think that'll be a very good talk. So that's what's happening with InfoHealth. And then because we're in the middle of the Nobel series, and we've done the physics prize, the chemistry prize yesterday, and then next week we break order because it'll be the economics prize, then the medicine prize, and then that'll be me again, and then the Peace Prize, and then finish off with the prize in literature. I think the last is the most challenging because there are two laureates, two different books, two different authors this year. So that's what's ahead. Now, the subject today is artificial intelligence. I've written a fair bit about this in the local newspapers and one book. By the way, did you remember to bring those books?
I do have them.
Okay, good. Okay. Do you have actually the two of them?
I only have one. I have one. It's in
Okay,
the
wait, I just want to show people. Yeah, because this one, I think, and Janelle will probably support me on it, but Eric Topol, Deep Medicine, and he's a cardiologist, I think, isn't he? A cardiologist, but he also happens to know a great deal about artificial intelligence, and the subject is artificial intelligence and healthcare. So that's very, very good. And what's the other one? It doesn't matter. There is I'm just going to step aside here we are. I just ran into this, that we've got, if you ask for it, the library will probably give you a copy, but I ran across this, well, it's October the 17th. New England Journal of Medicine has it's not bedtime reading, but it is very cogent. And it's how artificial intelligence is changing healthcare delivery. And guess what? It's from the Harvard Medical School and the Harvard Business School and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. So that's a really powerful team looking at AI and healthcare. And I guess the group that's not listed in there would be MIT, but they'd have a large part of this probably in the development of AI. So that's something to just have a look at and see if you'd be interested in it. It's a little dense in places, but it does cover the issues. So we had two students presenting this afternoon. Janelle Payne, who's an applicant for the medical school in Niagara, and she is a Bachelor of Science but it's in psychology, right? Yeah, in psychology from Tulsa, University of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Isn't that interesting? But also a background at McGill. And she's had a research interest, which is interesting because they're looking at neurocognitive aspects of anxiety and the kind of downstream effects into adulthood of child head trauma, right, or brain trauma. Am I right?
Emotional trauma.
Emotional trauma. Okay, well that's even more worthwhile. Okay, so and then we have Maham Khalid, whose mother isn't here. Yes, and so she's a graduate in interdisciplinary medical sciences, right? Is that right?
Yes.
From the University of Western Ontario, right? My alma mater. So now Mom is in her first year, but second year, just beginning the second year, right? Yeah. Okay. So you've had all of that difficult transition from beginning, right? So you're heavily immersed in it now. So both of them are very competent, and I might say that really of the two, Janelle has actually used AI in some of your experimental work, right? At least you have some familiarity with it. So who's heading on? Okay, good. You have the podium. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I'm Mahal, and this is Janelle, and we're just going to be presenting on AI in medicine. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and listen to us speak. All right.
It's actually me who's starting. Just
Yeah.
wait. We're switching around.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, just playing musical chairs. Okay. Oops, this is gonna stick. Okay, that's fine. So before we begin our presentation, we kind of just want to do a brief overview of what artificial intelligence is. Most of us might have the experience with the lovely Alexa device in our homes, interrupting us at times when we're not actually speaking to her, but that happens to me all the time. But essentially, artificial intelligence doesn't have one set definition per se, but in essence, it's computers that are attempting to mimic or duplicate the function of the human brain. And in doing this, they are taking in large data sets and through the use of algorithms, and they're able to interpret these data sets to find specific patterns and then create various outputs. So artificial intelligence is really starting to take off in a variety of settings. And so throughout this presentation, we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence in general, how the brain works, and then kind of diving into its impact on medicine and the future. Okay.
All right, so getting a little bit more into artificial intelligence, both machine learning and deep learning are a subset of it, deep learning being a subset of machine learning. So it's kind of like a hierarchy type of thing. So machine learning is kind of like using algorithms to predict futures using the data points you have, and also developing and modeling functions. Deep learning, on the other hand, is using neural networks, which are artificial, and kind of analyzing that information, interpreting it itself. Another difference is that with machine learning, usually you have analysts there to kind of interpret the information and guide the machine along, versus deep learning is usually self-directed and it's able to come to these decisions itself. Additionally, with deep learning, usually it's a couple of thousand data points on average that you're using, versus opposite. Machine learning is a couple of thousand data points, versus deep learning could actually be a couple of million data points, and just the amount of data it's able to process is a lot more. Overall, though, AI is dynamic. It's able to learn from the mistakes it has, and it's also able to learn from its data points. So the more data you give it, the more able it is to do its function.
Excuse me.
Yes.
On that last one, could you just kind of go and show us the purpose of the car and the person and then the dots and
Oh, sure.
the output? I see output there.
Yeah, sure.
In lay language sort of thing, like.
So with machine learning, you see that there's a human here. So a human is kind of gonna extract the data, and then a machine is gonna classify it and it'll tell you that it's a car. Over here, you don't actually have the human involvement. It's the program itself is able to extract the data, analyze it, and tell you it's a car.
So the car's sitting there and the machine is analyzing the car and saying it's a car.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Wonderful. So we're just gonna do a brief overview of the history of AI, which is actually really interesting. Going before 1956, and if we look all the way back to World War II, we can actually see kind of an informal form of AI take place. And a man named Alan Turing, not Alfred, I don't know where I got that, is responsible for using AI in its basic form to crack the Enigma code, which is actually a code used, some of you might have seen the movie recently, but cracking the Enigma code that helped us win World War II. And that was actually using a big computer to kind of break through the patterns of German code and to decipher it. But the term artificial intelligence wasn't actually coined until 1956 by John McCarthy, and he was kind of responsible for just really starting research with AI. And he actually was one of the first people to come up with an algorithm that was able to master checkers. So AI in that time, all the way back in 1956, was already able to kind of master different moves of checkers by itself. And then we kind of skip forward to the 1960s. There was a lot more of a push for algorithms, so using algorithms to solve mathematical equations and really complex theorems. And then kind of this first robot, multi-purpose robot was built. His name was Shaky in 1969. So that's just kind of how AI really kind of took a big leap from when it was first coined in the 56 all the way to 69 to a robot that was able to perform basic tasks and functions. And then from the late 60s, mid 70s, all the way up to the early 90s, there was kind of this period dawned as the AI winter. For a variety of reasons, political and otherwise, there wasn't a lot of funding and research put into AI development, and so it was just kind of a period of relative quiet. And then into the late 90s, there kind of was, again, a takeoff with AI. There was a development of the internet, and so we see AI kind of taking on a more of a global scale. We see the US and Japan actually becoming bigger players in there. They had a lot of lofty goals for AI, specifically with things like using computers for translation. They were hoping that they would eventually be able to find computers who were able to reason and achieve complex tasks. And so in 1997, there was a supercomputer created called Deep Blue, and he was designed through the use of algorithms and machine learning and deep learning to learn and beat the world chess champion in a game, which is pretty amazing. And then as we take off into the modern era, you can look at all the major corporations, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and see how they use AI in everyday life. As I mentioned before with Alexa, every time we talk to Alexa, we're giving her some more data for speech recognition, facial recognition. Every time you look at your iPhone and it scans your face to let you log in. I don't know if that's, everyone has an iPhone they can look at, but yeah, so that's all examples in modern time. And why we're able to accomplish all of these things is we now have these computers that have massive data storage abilities and processing power. So it's really allowed us to kind of step forward and grow in the industry. And it's also really beneficial for companies like Facebook, Amazon, et cetera, who are able to kind of track their consumer patterns and tailor advertisements and other things of that nature to consumers. So I always think it's funny every time when I will be talking about something and then I'll look on my phone on Facebook and the first advertisement is what I was talking about. I'm like, that's so creepy. How does that happen? But somebody I think is listening to me, or it's just a text I sent, and they're tracking that. And so in turn, they're able to find specific advertisements that I might be more interested in. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of a modern example of AI. So now we're going to talk kind of about the human brain.
All right, so we've decided to split this up a little bit. In the beginning we did AI, now we're doing humans, and then we're gonna kind of integrate the two. So with the human brain, this is our computer box. This is how we process things. It's involved in everything we do. And it's kind of divided into your central nervous system, which is your brain, and your spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system, which basically is the rest of your body. So in the central nervous system, the brain we'll talk about later, but the spinal cord is kind of like neural fibers, which transmits information from your periphery up to your brain, and then from your brain back to your periphery. It's also involved in reflexes, which are kind of all computed in your spinal cord and are super fast because it doesn't have to travel that far. Versus your peripheral nervous system, which has your somatic nervous system, which is your voluntary movement. It's where, say, your hand is on a hot stove. That's actually a reflex, but it's okay. Your hand is on a hot stove. You feel that hot temperature. The information goes using your afferent sensory fibers to your spinal cord, and then back through your motor fibers out to your hand to take your hand away. Versus your autonomic nervous system, which is divided further into your sympathetic and parasympathetic. And these two are kind of opposites. Your sympathetic is your fight or flight. It raises your blood pressure, it raises your heart rate, it sends more blood to your brain. It kind of gets you ready to fight or flight. And then you have your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your rest and digest. It kind of controls your digestion, your reproductive features, and kind of is more of a easy system in my head. So, moving on to our actual computer in our bodies, it's our brain. So, our brain is very complex, but the big part up here is the cerebrum, and that's divided into two hemispheres, your right and your left. Broadly speaking, your right controls the left side of your body, and your left controls the right side of your body. And then you have your cerebral cortex, which is divided into all sorts of lobes. You have your frontal lobe, which is important for executive functioning, making decisions, and has a part of it called the motor cortex, which is important for movement. Then behind that, you have your parietal lobe, which is involved in your perception and kind of your sensations, and the sensation part of it comes from your somatosensory cortex. Then you have your temporal lobe, which is involved in memory, understanding language, those sorts of things. And that's really important because your temporal lobe communicates with another part of your brain called your hippocampus, which is involved in short and long-term memory. And then at the back, you have your occipital lobe, which is involved in vision. Then moving down a little bit, it isn't labeled, but this is your cerebellum. And that's kind of our coordination system. It's how it takes information from your brain from the top and also your spinal cord, and kind of gives you a sense of where your body is in space. It's able to maintain your posture, and it's also important for muscle memory. And then at the bottom, you have your brainstem. This is kind of important for all sorts of autonomic functions, such as breathing, like vomiting. Breathing, vomiting are the two I can think of right now. I don't know why I can't think of it.
And eye movement, right?
And eye movement, yes, that's a better example. Like vomiting. All right, so that's kind of your brain in a big picture, but that seems very divided. So how do these kind of locations communicate with each other? That comes into a neuron. So a neuron is basically a cell in your brain, which is used to communicate signals from one part to the other. So you have your cell body over here, which has your nucleus. And this is just like maintaining the neuron, getting it energy, and helping it function. On either side, you either have a dendrite, which receives information from other neurons, or you have the axon, which sends information to other neurons. So if you have, say, a signal that comes that says, yes, we're gonna go fire, and that kind of goes to your dendrite, it gets computed over here, and then it's an electrical signal that's sent down your axon all the way to the other end. That's your axonal terminal. Over here, you have neurotransmitters, which are basically the chemicals involved in signaling in your brain, and those get released onto a neuron over here beside it. And depending on which sequence of neurons is activated, you do different things. For instance, so yeah, and in your brain, you also have myelin sheaths, and these are basically insulators that allow electrical signals to go faster, and so you're able to compute all these things that you have to compute and basically analyze millions of data points that you have. So that brings us to the Human Connectome. So this was a project kind of started by the National Institutes of Health to kind of map our brain into, divide it into both functional units, but also structural units. And they're still going on, they haven't done it, but they're able to map out so many pathways to figure out how we think and how our brain works. And this research, it was super important in not only understanding disease processes, but also kind of giving us more information into the black box inside our head. And that relates to deep learning, kind of, where deep learning was artificial neural networks, and these are our own neural networks. And it relates to how AI is a human brain but computer.
So now we're gonna, after that brief summary of the human brain, we're gonna jump back into kind of differentiating artificial intelligence versus humans. And I think it's really, really important to make a key distinction going forward is that just because AI and an algorithm in a data set is able to be recognized and an output is formed, it does not necessarily mean that the computer is understanding what happens. And that's like a huge thing in separating humans and computers. We're able to learn something and truly understand it, but to our knowledge, computers are not understanding the data that they're analyzing. So it's important to kind of talk about how humans learn versus how computers learn. So humans, from the time they're born, you're adapting to your environment. Your memories help you learn, you're growing, and you're learning just from natural processes. And humans are also have the ability to multitask, so we can do multiple things at one time, and as we age, we get better at multitasking. AI, on the other hand, while it attempts to mimic human behavior, it doesn't, and it's not like something we can And AI is just not gonna suddenly start learning things. We as humans have to give it a data set, give it an algorithm, give it an input, so it's able to learn and grow from that point. And then also, AI is not typically able to multitask in a sense. Typically, algorithms are very, very specific. So the algorithm that is used in self-driving cars is gonna be very different than the algorithm used for ECGs and tracking heart rates. So it's very important to note that it's not capable of all these complex multitasking activities. And then finally, going forward, this idea of human oversight being essential. We're gonna discuss briefly about the morality of AI and all of those sorts of things later on, but this idea that humans are needed to create AI. That is, humans are needed to create the data sets, input the data sets, create the algorithms, and take the output and actually use it. So humans were necessary to oversee all of the complex processes. So now we're gonna kind of jump into this lovely little chart here. So this is from a 2016 study, and it's, I guess one of the biggest things is AI is going to take over all of our jobs, and we're gonna have a bunch of robots working around, and humans aren't gonna be doing much of anything. So this is kind of seeing, is that possible? Are we actually gonna be able to become like full automation of labor at some point in our lives? So if we go to the very bottom here, this game called Go. So Go is this super complicated game. It has like over 10,000 moves, a million gameplay scenarios. And they predicted from 2016 that AI, in the next 10 years was gonna be able to play as well as the best human in the world. And AI actually did better than that. Very recently, they beat the Go champion. The cool thing about that was when they looked at how AI beat the Go champion, they didn't really know. It's because of all the gameplays, all of these things, none of this move that the computer used to win was never seen before. It wasn't a practical move. And so AI kind of was able to learn and develop and see like, hey, this move made sense, which is really interesting and kind of baffling. And as we go up in kind of complexity of task here, we see everything from a retail salesperson up to a surgeon, which we're going to discuss later on, and then finally this concept of the full automation of labor, this idea that all human jobs, from a doctor to a firefighter to a mechanic, are going to be able to be replaced by AI. And I think a key thing to note here is, although they're saying that maybe in 125 years, it's a huge range. It could be way past in the future, 300 years from now, or it could be as short as 65, 70 years from now. But it's important to note that just because AI is capable of doing this doesn't mean that it will, and also the fact that jobs and the nature of jobs are constantly shifting. Every day, new jobs are being formed, and so AI might be able to take over the current jobs we have now, but that's not saying that when it does capable of doing that, that there won't be a million other jobs that humans are needed to use. So that's just kind of something important to note, and it kind of leads us into this idea that AI is truly becoming this international phenomenon, and we'll talk about kind of its global impact. So this is kind of a chart that's kind of showing the talent pool. So where the largest talent or people who are capable of actually doing this AI algorithms, the best of the best in computer science and mathematics and all of these things. And they're heavily concentrated, well, at least right now, in two main areas, and that is the United States and in China. And there's a lot of a media frenzy right now with all of these headlines where US versus China and the race to determine and win all the AI and move the furthest ahead. And the question is like, why does it matter? Why are they trying to do that? And as we know, AI is most likely going to change the face of the global economy in the near future. And so it makes a lot of sense that China and the US, who are becoming superpowers in the world economy right now, would want to be at the forefront of research and innovation in this area. So right now, the US has most of the jobs and infrastructure in place for AI. But China is quickly approaching them. They have this kind of goal that by 2030, they're going to dominate the AI game. And they have ways of doing that. They have a much larger population, and the government is willing to put in a lot of funding to bring some of the talent pool that have gone away to China back home. And so we see that, and we'll see the face. So no one really knows kind of what's going to happen with that. We know that predicted by 2013, $15.7 trillion in GDP is going to be devoted just to AI development. $7 trillion of that is expected to come from China alone. So there's huge infrastructure, huge market in place, and we'll just kind of have to see how it all plays out. So now we're going to get back to the main topic of this presentation, and that's artificial intelligence and medicine. And so there's a couple of key points that I wanna address here, and kind of maybe some of the issues right now in healthcare system in Canada, and how AI might be able to be used to fix some of these issues. So medicine's kind of stuck behind the rest of the world in technological innovation, and there's a variety of reasons for this. We could have stubborn doctors, or we could have, just a little bit less of a trustworthiness in new technology. So we're in this idea that we're in this kind of fourth industrial revolution, or fourth stage, and medicine's very much stuck in the third. We're kind of less likely to adapt to new technology. And if we go forward looking at some of the main issues that at least I've heard from people and see to be common themes of issues with medicine right now, there's the concept of shallow medicine, and then this data entry focus. So shallow medicine, it's this idea that sometimes when you might go into a doctor's office, you feel like it's very dry, like you're not connecting with the doctor. You feel like the doctor doesn't really have a good understanding. You're sitting there, maybe you have 10 minutes to actually talk to them, and in that time, they're typing behind their computer. You quickly spit out a diagnosis and maybe a prescription. You don't feel like you actually gained anything from that interaction. And on the same side, the doctors don't really feel like they're making that big of an impact. They might feel overworked, if they don't have enough time to truly cater to all of their patients. And that's a huge issue. Lacking those interpersonal skills for a variety of reasons is a huge impact right now in Canada and the US. And then also this idea of data entry focus. There's the institutionalization of electronic health records, and they're everywhere. And every doctor might have a slightly different system. So when you go see your cardiologist, your GP is not necessarily, unless you release the data, going to be getting all that information. So when you go into your doctor, they might not have a total idea of your entire health history, which could affect how they treat you and how a diagnosis is reached. So kind of drawing on these two very prevalent issues in medicine, and this idea that medicine right now is kind of stuck behind the rest of the world, we're going to be looking at how AI is currently being adapted into medicine, and also kind of the future of AI in medicine and where it's kind of going. So there's some companies I want to discuss also, like Apple, Google, and A-Line, and they're also really responsible for AI and health tracking devices and things of that nature. So going forward, I broke it down into specialties. And so the specialties on the far left of the screen are all very pattern-centric specialties. So they use a lot of imaging patterns to reach diagnosis. And AI, as I mentioned before, is making exceptional strides and is very good at things like facial recognition, recognizing voice, recognizing images. So these specialties have been able to use AI and show great promise in incorporating an AI. So things like radiology. Radiologists look at x-rays and imaging all day, thousands and thousands a month of x-rays and scans. And there's also, because of this, a chance that there's going to be a little bit of inaccuracy, and a lot of false positives and false negatives for certain things. And so in a very, very big study that recently came out, an AI program was developed and looked at 50,000 x-rays. And it actually had a 95% accuracy in determining the results of a potential diagnosis, as well as eliminating a lot of those false negatives and false positives that radiologists have. And we're not sitting here saying that we should replace all radiologists' jobs because they're not accurate enough. I think more what they're saying is that there's so much work, so many scans that are taken every day, so many things. And if we're able to kind of simplify a radiologist's job, that is, maybe say, hey, this is a pile of scans that look totally fine, and the AI system is accurate enough to be able to determine that, versus, hey, these scans, might need a second look. And that would really be able to separate when a doctor's not needed versus when a radiologist should step in and use their practical experience to actually solve the issue. And this, again, is very similar with pathology and dermatology. The AI has better accuracy at determining, examining biopsies. And the key thing to note, though, especially with pathology, in a study that they did, was that when a pathologist had unlimited time, there was no time constraints at all, and they were able to spend as much time as they wanted looking at the biopsy, examining it, they had the exact same accuracy as the machine. But obviously, we live in a world where it's no such thing as unlimited time. Everybody's on a time crunch. And so, again, AI might be able to come in and actually help just reduce that pressure, the time pressures that pathologists, dermatologists, people like that face on a daily basis. And that's, again, the same for dermatology, looking at screens. 15% of all doctor visits go to a dermatologist. There's a huge demand for dermatology, wait lists for months and months and months. They're developing apps right now where potentially they can take a picture of your face and tell you what potential your acne might be or skin lesions on your face. And it can kind of help reduce that workload and that pressure on the dermatologist and let people take more of a first-hand approach in their own care. So going forward to the next set of health specialties, optometry, cardiology, oncology, and surgery. While they might not be as heavily reliant on imaging, these ones actually have some really big effects with AI, and I find AI extremely useful. So in oncology, optometry, diseases of the eye are very common. The number one cause of eye disease is diabetic retinopathy. And Google, and the use of Google AI, has actually been able to find a screening device that literally, an app that would take a picture of your eye and automatically be able to tell if you have diabetic retinopathy, which is amazing because now not only is that helpful for doctors to treat, but also for us as patients to be able to say, hey, I know I have this. What can I do, lifestyle changes, or what can I do, what appointment should I set up? So it allows us to kind of take that first-hand step in our own care and becoming really an active member of our healthcare team. And then if we move on to oncology and surgery, oncology is very similar with pathology, dermatology. Computers just have a better accuracy in, I guess, determining when something might be malignant or not and treating that. And so we obviously still need the doctors to carry out from the diagnosis to actually the treatment part of things, but being able to kind of expedite the diagnosis process is extremely helpful in reducing the amount of time we have to wait to actually see a doctor. And then finally, surgery. As you saw in the chart before me, surgery was one of the most, possibly the soonest, the closest to being actually able to be taken over by AI. And surgery right now, about 10% of surgeries worldwide are actually carried out with AI technology or robotic surgery. But there's a possibility that in the near future, robots might be able to do surgery a little bit better than humans. And there's many reasons for that. They're a lot more precise. There is a company right now that actually creates a line of robots. And they're all connected by the cloud, just like the iPhones are all connected by the cloud. You have all your data in the cloud, this theoretical cloud. And so all of these robots all around the world that are in use right now are connected. So every surgery that they do, all the other robots, even though they're not there, see the surgery, learn from the surgery, learn the techniques from the surgery, and in turn are able to have these procedures that are far more efficient, less invasive, less risk aversive, and so they might actually end up being the answer for surgery. Not saying we don't need surgeons, but it's probably one of the specialties that's most likely to benefit or be taken over from AI. And then finally, kind of two broad topics, mental health and health systems. You might say, mental health, no way. There's no chance that a computer is ever going to be able to understand the human brain and all of those components better than us. But it's kind of interesting. In the study, people reported that they felt more comfortable talking to a computer person, like an AI human, than a real human. And I don't know if that's because people are embarrassed about mental health, if there's still obviously that overwhelming stigma, and so they just felt a lot more comfortable. And then with the increase in technology with facial recognition and deep learning neural networks that we've talked about briefly, we're able to kind of get a more composite view. There's so many markers for depression and schizophrenia and other mental health disorders, and it's hard to pinpoint, well, this means you have depression. But AI has found great success in being able to look at facial expression, look at the way people respond to certain questions, look at how they post on their social media, and use this to determine who is most likely to have depression. And so it's quite fascinating how just those simple things are actually able to find a diagnosis or potentially help find a diagnosis. And then finally, this concept of health systems. I briefly talked about how electronic health records cause a lot of issues. You see doctors behind the screen typing constantly. Records might be all over the place. You're not getting a composite view. The hope is in the future, potentially, that health systems are going to be able to be more compact. People might be able to have all of their health records summarized before they even see their doctors, so that their doctor is able to actually spend the time conversing with the patient, getting to know them, getting to know their diagnosis. Or even with the increase in speech recognition, having doctors be able to just talk out loud, their notes are automatically transcribed into a computer, and now it's a lot easier. They don't have to type them out. They can simply just speak, and their notes are there. Less time in front of the computer, creating a better connection with patients. And now finally, I wanted to bring up this whole concept of a moral dilemma. And so there's 3 images on the screen here. It's a study that they had to do with automation of vehicles. And so there's a lot of people worried about, self-driving cars, what happens with accidents, who's reliable, who's the person who's actually going to be able to blame if a self-driving car hits somebody. And so there's, an AI system was given 3 different scenarios. The first scenario is, you're driving a car, there's going to be an accident, who do you choose to hit? One passerby or a group of pedestrians? Obviously the person said, I'm going to hit one passerby, the AI system, sorry. For the next scenario, it was, who do you choose to injure here? Do I choose to injure the person driving the car or in the car, or do I choose to injure one passerby? And they chose to injure the passerby, keeping the person in the car safe. But then here comes the final scenario, which is a little bit more complex. Do I injure a big group of pedestrians or the person driving the car? Obviously, there's no right or wrong decision, but as humans, it's hard enough to decide which moral dilemma makes the most sense, which one we feel is the most. Do we save the masses or do we protect ourselves? And how are we expecting an AI system to be able to do this? So going forward with this, it's in essence that AI is programmed by humans, and thus we have our biases, which we'll discuss later, that are input into this. And we can't expect that AI is going to be able to make these moral decisions on itself. And so as doctors, as people, we have to be held accountable for any decision that AI makes, because we can't expect an AI system to be able to make these choices when human beings can't at all either. Awesome. So now we're going to segue into ethical concerns.
Alright, so with ethical concerns, this is not going to be an exhaustive list, but it's a couple of the ones that we thought were really big problems that we wanted to kind of discuss. So the first one we all hear and hear again and again is unemployment and wealth inequality. So the biggest thing with AI is we're worried that it's going to take over our jobs and it's going to impact the livelihoods of so many people. The other concern with this is that the way the hierarchy of work labor kind of works is the more automatic it becomes and the more computer-based it becomes, you move away from kind of physical labor to more cognitive labor. Cognitive labor often involves people going to university, getting that education, but who's able to afford to do that? So that starts to create more wealth inequality. And then in terms of a bigger institutional and systems kind of way, it's which companies can implement AI, who can afford to do it, and also the fact that companies choose to kind of cut their losses and minimize their losses and minimize the amount of cost they have. So if you have a robot on one hand versus a human who requires an hourly wage, who do you pick? So these are a couple of concerns that we have. The other one is humanity. A lot of healthcare workers and a lot of allied healthcare workers really pride themselves on the human connection they make with their patients. And as Janelle discussed earlier, even with electronic medical records, a big concern is that they feel like they're typing all the time and they aren't able to kind of see those nonverbal cues and make that eye contact and develop that rapport. So the more we implement AI, the more we kind of move away from that. On the flip side of that, though, is that AI has unlimited resources. It can kind of be empathetic and kind to everyone it meets. It doesn't have the limited emotional capacity a lot of humans do. So humans might tire, but AI doesn't experience the same burnout we all do. The next one is mistakes. So the way AI works is that you have an initial testing phase where you give it a bunch of data points, it analyzes them, and it works, and it kind of develops a pattern. However, this is a sample size. It's not going to represent everyone. And when you actually put it out there, it might see things and do things that it wasn't tested on in its testing phase. An example of this is that Microsoft implemented a chat robot on Twitter to try to communicate more, but that robot within a day was spewing racial slurs and Nazi propaganda. Microsoft obviously stopped the program, but it shows how AI can make mistakes. And that kind of brings us to our next point, which is AI bias. So AI works on the data you give it. So if, say, you have a predominantly Caucasian sample of information that you're giving it, it's not going to be as applicable to the minorities. And that's kind of similar in how Amazon tried to use AI in its hiring process. But over a 10-year period, most of the people they screened and input into the AI machine were males. So that actual algorithm started showing a bias towards males over females. Amazon stopped the project as well. So we're always super concerned that humans are biased. We have that part in us that we aren't completely fair, but AI is designed by us and based on the data we give it. So is it not more susceptible to these biases? The next one is security. This is the one we're all worried about. So there's security in robots as soldiers or weaponry that we're all really worried about, but there's also security in our data. For instance, when you're on the internet, information is being collected about you in terms of your likes, your dislikes, the way you function, the way your brain works. And say somebody got access to that data and all of a sudden propaganda is being directed at you. So we have to be very careful with the way AI is used and how much and who we give access to. So as AI develops more and more, cybersecurity has to kind of kick up too. And then it's control and singularity. So one of the reasons humans kind of dominate the food chain is because of our intelligence and because we're able to use that to develop tools to keep us at the top. But what happens when AI is smarter than humans? What happens when we want to pull the plug, but AI predicts that move and prevents us from pulling the plug? And that kind of brings into the concept of singularity, where humans aren't the most intelligent beings anymore. And that brings us to evil genius. So movies like The Terminator and Matrix kind of make us very, very scared about the extent of which AI can go. And that's a very real concern. Experts say we aren't at that point right now, but it is a concern of when, since AI can make mistakes, it can also go rogue. And what happens when it starts making decisions and it becomes more self-aware and it decides it doesn't need that human control anymore. So, scary. Next.
You're not needed.
Next, we're going to go into the limitations of actually implementing AI technology. So the first one is privacy. So this has been a concept throughout our presentation about the fact that because it's all digital, that it can get hacked, and you have these computers who are capable of hacking, and that makes your information available to anyone who's able to access it. And this is a very minor example, but for instance, say you have information about people's mental health records, and insurance companies are accessing this and making decisions based on that. It's not something we want, and it's a really big concern everyone has. The next one is expenditure. So not only is research and development super expensive to do, but also kind of implementing the actual AI technology. And once you implement it, maintaining that. So who's able to afford it? And if it is going to be a public expenditure, where do we get the money from? Next, we have a skill shortage. So like a lot of other disciplines that are coming to be, there is a skill shortage where data analysts and data scientists aren't that easy to come by. So if we do want to kind of move ahead and get AI implemented in day-to-day life and move forward with this, we really have to make sure that we're also encouraging people to kind of pursue these fields and go into them. Next, we have accuracy. So as we discussed before, AI is only as smart as the data you give it. And it does learn from its mistakes, but the entire learning period is very dicey on how we want to implement it, because you can test it, but the information you give it might not be representative of what it's actually going to be facing. For instance, if you test it on a population in downtown Toronto, and then you use it in Sudbury, how will it actually work? Will it be able to kind of it won't adapt to local populations and local trends. And then we have availability of data. So this is a very big concern, because if, let's say, smaller hospitals want to implement AI, they don't have the data required to actually properly train the AI machines and make sure that you're going through that rehearsal period so it doesn't make mistakes. And also the biases in the data we do present to it. A lot of research in the past has been done on males. It has been done on Caucasian predominantly samples. So how are we gonna use that information and train a machine, but then apply it to people who are from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of genders? And lastly, it's compartmentalized healthcare data and implementation time. So the way our healthcare system works right now is, as Janelle was saying, you don't have a lot of communication between, let's say, one hospital and another hospital in downtown Toronto. So if you...
Or doctor to doctor.
Or doctor to doctor as well.
That's right.
So if you implement an AI machine in one hospital, how will you make sure that data from another hospital is kind of being met and everyone's being able to use it properly? And that also goes into implementation time. Let's say you do want to get this going and you do want to get the ball rolling on this. How much time is it actually going to take, and how many resources is it actually going to take, and where do you get the money from?
So we're at the kind of end of our presentation, but we're going to be leaving with some future possible directions and questions unanswered. So future possible directions. There's so many directions for AI to take. We're already seeing it almost with self-driving cars, all of those things. The opportunities are endless. But in a medical sense, what are the most foreseeable future? And some of them that I found really interesting were this idea of genes, drugs, diet, and beyond. So these kind of 3 areas here are ones that AI could really have a really profound impact in. So, for genes, genome sequencing takes a long time, and it takes a lot of resources. AI would have the ability to sequence an entire human genome way quicker, and that provides us with a lot of really positives for medicine. We're able to maybe potentially find more risks of mutations, diagnose many different conditions. There's already an app around that by facial features alone. It's called Face to Gene. We're able to diagnose 4,000 potentially rare conditions. And so there's lots of future for gene and gene sequencing and using AI technology to help us better understand our genes. For drugs, there is so much literature out there about potential drug uses to help certain disorders and diseases. If we're able to use AI to be able to read all of this, intake and analyze all of this literature that would take a human being so much time, and then on top of that, contrast it with all of the potential compounds that are used to make drugs, we might actually find a bunch of new drugs to target specific disorders that we never had before. And newly inputting AI into this, we might be able to kind of step away from preliminary testing and, like, for example, animal testing, and we might be able to skip that altogether and use AI to kind of start us right into human trials. And then finally, the one I think is most interesting is diet. And like, there's so many diets. Everyone's always telling you that this diet's the best or this diet's the best. And what happens if we actually can find out what diet's the best? If AI is able to look at all of these data, maybe they can help us find that diet that actually is the best for being healthy, the best for reducing risk of heart disease or diabetes. And so there truly are endless opportunities for AI to go. And then from Siri to the virtual medical assistant. This one might be a little bit more far-fetched, but we talk to Siri all the time. We talk to WebMD all the time. Same thing that will, if you type in that you have a paper cut, tell you that you're dying. What is the chances that one day we might be able to have this virtual medical assistant? If we're able to somehow, it seems a bit far-fetched, but have these big, deep neural networks with all of this information, a total health history of the person, all their environmental factors, comprised with all the medical literature, and then tracking. If we have on our watches, ECGs, etc., we might be able to, in the future, have a medical assistant that is going to say, hey, I noticed your oxygen levels were down last night. Do a test like this, or maybe I'll call your doctor. They might be able to kind of help us take leadership and ownership of our own health, and in turn, improve our health experience. And then finally, the kind of overarching question unanswered. What I've kind of taken away from this presentation is that there's a million different ways that AI can help medicine. And kind of the biggest and I see is there a way that AI can help our doctors become more humane? If we're able to somehow mitigate the effects of the constant time crunches, the constant need to, see as many patients as possible. And if AI is able to help with that by making diagnoses a lot more accessible, reducing the wait times in hospitals because we're able to screen patients a lot quicker, is that gonna help our doctors spend more time? I guess at the end of the day, we have to realize that there's so many potential futures for AI, and that doctors are going to need to work with AI and learn to work with AI to help them out in the end. And doctors struggle with this too. There's so much burnout that occurs when doctors don't feel like they're being appreciated or that they can't actually see as many patients as they want. And so my hope is that AI is used in a proper way, that we're able to implement it into healthcare systems to really help the future of medicine and our patient experience. Thank you.
That concludes
Relax. Well, thank you very much, and it was excellent. I mean, you covered a lot of ground. And I found myself in almost every slide 2 or 3 times saying, oh yeah, but you could say this. There's a lot of material here, and the field is moving forward very, very rapidly. So I mean, I'm very optimistic, but I think the medical profession is by nature culturally very conservative. It took them a long time, and even now, struggling with e-records. And it's got nothing to do with ethics. It's got to do with time invested. Now, when you go to the Mayo Clinic, for example, join their staff, there's a mandatory 2 to 4 week training period, which you have to go through for voice recognition stuff, dictation, understanding their systems. There is nothing like that I know of in Ontario, at least in Canada. So, and these are complex systems. But the other thing that struck me going through this are the number of times where AI kind of takes a hit. Well, gee, we don't really understand how it reached this conclusion. Well, I don't really understand how I reached conclusions. And most humans make conclusions and decisions in medicine. So I think that's a bit of a false hit. And as to the question of bias and the data, I'm biased. Most of my career has been in a tertiary care hospital, which isn't representative of villages and towns. So we all have our biases. And I think it stands to improve healthcare a lot. I would guess, just looking at the trajectory of this, what we were talking about earlier was that AI is kind of a single algorithm per problem, so to speak. And the hint has been, well, it'll never develop the kind of general intelligence that humans have. I don't see an issue with that. I think it'll happen. It'll happen within 50 years, 100 years, 150 years. Remember, our own evolution is only 300 to 250,000 years old, long. AI is going to truck that probably at 1% at that time. So, and we're not getting necessarily smarter. It is, and furthermore, it doesn't forget. One of its big impacts, we mentioned the skin lesions, the morphology, is the ability to read anatomic data, to read imaging data better than all but the very best physicians. The skin lesion one is a huge one in dermatology. It really means that somebody in Deansville, seeing their family physician, if a picture were taken and it was sent to a site that had AI, the facility, at least you'd come up with the 95% chance that the AI decision will be right. Well, that's better than most dermatologists. So I think that's a huge plus. So communities that are more remote can access technologies and help in the decision making. So I mean that's my read on it. Now, any questions that you have? No?
There's so many questions. It's
Yeah.
hard to kind of process everything. But just thinking of bias, like in laboratory data, most of the normal ranges were done using young male med students or something, and then they related them maybe to female results. So we've had a bias like that for a long time.
Yeah, that was human directed.
Yeah, human
Behind
directed.
AI.
Exactly, and
Yeah, that's exactly right.
yeah, and so that's nothing. I can say that's not really new.
Yeah.
So something you have to deal with. I know.
And in fact, it may be correctable.
Yeah, sure, it is
Probably is.
correctable.
Yeah.
What is the reason for this bias, that they only took samplings or the data?
Cultural, I think in part.
Convenience.
I mean,
No, but why wasn't there?
there were all
female
kinds of
data?
biases,
Why-
adults over kids, males over females,
Yeah.
right?
Time and money.
People who had the money to be able to pay, who could access the system. There are all manner of biases in the healthcare system.
Okay, and the other question I have about this whole thing is who is ultimately in control? Like you're talking about Google having access to all this personal information about us, and then the government would have a say in things. But ultimately, right now, who is currently
You
in
know what?
charge of
The
this?
government's stupid when it comes to AI.
Well, that's
They're
the
kind of
fear.
way
That's
behind
the
the
fear,
pack.
is that these companies
Yeah.
are gathering too much data on us.
I mean, it's been interesting watching Zuckerberg and others
Yeah.
in congressional committee being questioned. The senators and members of Congress have almost no clue. So they weren't actually questioned wisely. They don't know what to ask, and they don't know how to evaluate the stuff that they do get. And so that's really so computer literacy among that generation of people, including myself, is actually very low. So I mean, I think that's a real issue.
But do you think in the end that the country or that who collects the most data will have a great advantage over other?
Well, I think it's one of the advantages. For example, they brought up China.
China, because they seem to be.
Because you have a government system that allows them total access to facial recognition. Okay, if your face appears anywhere on the internet or in public, maybe even in your own home in some way, it joins the hordes of others of data. In fact, some people have suggested that with the current technology, probably half of Americans are on some file somewhere
Yeah.
for their faces. Okay, so at immigration, when you cross borders, boy, that's a huge change, isn't it? And that's all without your permission or even awareness, except you're aware that when you stare at your iPhone, it goes on for you. And your fingerprints. And you thought that was okay? Well, I don't know that it is okay. So I think that's probably the major concern right now. But I think the benefits here, I mean, this is not to aid physicians. I think it's going to end up replacing many of the functions that physicians have. I mean, after all, think about medicine 100 years ago. How many radiologists were there? What, one? With poisonous x-rays? And now we have culturally whole groups of people going through medical training and deciding, gee, I want to do radiology because it makes a lot of money, which it does
Dermatology.
up until
No
now,
oncology.
which it does up until now, and a diversion of talent from where it's actually really needed.
Yeah.
And if AI can read 80 or 90% of the MRIs and CT scans at least as well or better than most radiologists, doesn't have to be perfect, because we're not perfect. We miss stuff. And but it at least learns from its mistakes, and many physicians don't learn from their mistakes. That's one of the issues of being out in practice and about re-licensure, say every 10 years. After all, to maintain my pilot proficiency thing, every 2 years somebody has to sit in the right seat and watch me go through all the procedures out there for maybe an hour and a half. Most of us got our licenses when we were in our teenage years, and we haven't been checked since. And that applies to a whole lot of other things. We graduated as a physician. Well, now there are some kind of checks, but not a lot. And we're kind of smart about getting through them. I think the United States is a little tougher. I think it's every 10 years, at least in my specialty, that there's some form of rigorous re-examination. But there's nothing like that in Canada. And nothing like at all in the UK. Heaven knows what it is elsewhere. Anything else? Yes?
I have a question. You said AI can be 90% accurate, we'll get rid of radiologists. Well, what if I want a second opinion? Because now if I'm diagnosed with a terminal disease,
Yeah.
I will get a second opinion.
Of course. you
So
might
if I
be-
go to another AI machine, it's gonna be the same, so it might.
No, it's not necessarily the
No?
same. No, it may be.
Is that a different
maybe a somewhat
database?
different data set.
Yeah.
So then would you, if you had something down in Toronto, you might have to go to Vancouver?
Yeah.
or might-
No, it's an aid, but I don't imagine this is going to be, we're going to keep the same number of, I don't wanna turn this into a battle against radiologists.
Oh, no, I'm just saying about a second opinion.
Many are my friends, but I don't wanna put them all out of a job.
Well, anything.
But I can certainly see a change coming.
Yeah.
And what was alluded to earlier, I think is true. The management will be better for complex problems such as some cancers.
I'm just wondering, will we eliminate getting a second opinion, so we would have to?
No.
Okay.
No.
So you could go to a different AI.
It could be a different AI, or AI might be the second opinion, or the third opinion. Or a conjoint opinion, which is probably the way it should be, which is the way it is at the
Yeah.
Sloan Kettering in the US when they're trying to figure out the best management for whatever cancer that you've got. So I see it as an ally. I mean, getting back to the flying analogy, I would not want to change my place now for what it was even 10 years ago. Because now, when I fly, I can see in real time the weather out for 500 nautical miles. All around me, I can see the ground artificially created underneath me, even if I'm in the clouds. I know exactly what my orientation is, and there's even one little program that came out AI directed, that if I have a heart attack on the spot, and somebody presses a button, Garmin has developed a system that will find the nearest airport with a runway that can take my aircraft,
And land or.
depending on the weather, and whether it has a precision approach, and land the aircraft. I'm gonna knock that? You gotta be crazy. So I think it's very, I'm very encouraged. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
What about the emotional aspect of being a doctor for 35 years? My greatest thing was to be able to say to a patient and communicate with them, to look
Yeah.
at them, see what they're doing, communicate. The history was the most important thing I learned in the Navy.
Yeah.
The pain and symptoms were a mystery to be solved and conquered, not a harbinger of doom. And each individual is different. I can't categorize all individuals and say, because you have that, that's that. You may be this, you may be that. That's being lost here because
Yeah,
we're all
well,
looking
no,
at
not
machines.
lost with AI. The problem is it was lost well before AI had any impact. I saw that in the 1990s and into the early 2000s because there was enormous pressure, especially in the United States, but here too, to, before that, it was an hour for a consultation. Then it came down to 40 minutes. Then it was down to 30 minutes. If it was to see them again, it went from half an hour down to 10 minutes or even 5 minutes, depending on the specialty. And then they're staring half of the time at a screen. You're telling me that's good care? No, it is not good care.
And then you could only take it, there was a time when you could only talk about
Yeah,
one thing.
and then somebody says, one joint per visit. I don't think that's good care at all. So AI helps that. And it was interesting, I don't know which of you refer to it, but the facial recognition software is actually quite nuanced now in recognizing emotional content. And maybe we recognize that right in plays, the picture, the actors, the one smiling and the other one's kind of sad, the classic ones. Those are all subtle tips sometimes to something that's going on, or the voice wavering or kind of changing, and the pauses, all that kind of stuff. Those are all subtle changes that an experienced human being and physician picks up those kind of clues, but you gotta be looking at the person to pick up those clues. And you have to spend 10 years at least learning them. If you haven't learned that kind of stuff, but anyway, AI does pick up those subtle clues. It doesn't know what you're thinking, but it certainly has probably a good idea of what your emotions are like as they are expressed in your gestures, and in your voice, and in your face. It's really quite clever. It can be fooled, for sure, but so can we be fooled. So last question.
It's also worth remembering that Bill Gates and
Yeah.
people who know what they're talking about here, to say that it's only in its infancy. And we're just touching a little bit at the beginning, like the first flight of the airplane compared to now. And with all these issues that we're talking about, I think a lot of them are gonna be solved. This is my view.
That's my sense too. I don't think it's an overly optimistic one. But there are several technologies that are kind of running at the same time. One of them, gene editing, which is a huge one, and getting better, more precise. You can edit 100 genes at a time, not just one. I mean, that's brand new, just in the last 2 or 3 months, at least in the literature. So that's a whole field. So now you're changing us. And then AI. So I think that, boy, there's more change taking place, and it has taken place in this century, and we're just in the first fifth of this century, right? Okay, anyway, so thank you very, very much, and